Have you ever heard of the television show Monsters Inside Me? Have you ever seen that terribly terrifying program, Monsters Inside of Me? If you haven't watched it, do yourself a favor. Don't. All right? Don't watch that show. If you don't know what it is, the premise of this show is it's a dramatization of real people who experienced a real situation where either a parasite or some other organism got into their body, and typically was unbeknownst to them that it was there, but over time, this living thing, this parasite, whatever it was, began to do damage. It, little by little, began to do damage to their bodies, to the point that when they finally realized what was going on, significant damage had already been done. And watching something like this, it's terrifying. I mean, it's as if these producers got together and thought, how can we take everyday people and turn them into paranoid hypochondriacs? Because that is what happens when you watch this show, Monsters Inside Me, right? You get a stomach ache, you think you have a tapeworm, right? You have a headache, you think you have a brain-eating amoeba. Right? But those are the things that this show will do to you, because you see these people that have these extremely, I don't know if I'd say rare, but they're extreme situations where there are these things within their bodies that are literally eating their bodies and destroying them on the inside. And now all of a sudden, everything you eat and everything you touch, you kind of wonder every once in a while, you get that weird feeling in your body you're not used to feeling, and you're wondering, is there something going on in there that's not supposed to be there? I like sushi, and they say not to eat sushi because of certain worms. Well, I avoid certain kinds of sushi because they are known to have higher risks involved, but I still eat some raw fish, and so I guess I'm asking to get a tapeworm or something like that. But to watch that show, it definitely can scare you a little bit to see what could happen. And as scary as it is to consider what can happen within our physical bodies when these parasites or these other organisms or these other living things begin to take up residence within our bodies, as kind of scary as that is, have you ever considered the spiritual parasites in our lives? Have you ever considered what spiritual parasites can do in our lives? Now, these aren't actual parasites like worms and other infectious things, but a physical parasite, when it goes into your body, at first you don't really notice it's there. At first you won't know anything is wrong at all, but little by little, as it begins to eat away and it begins to multiply and it begins to grow and it begins to spread, you will eventually begin to see the effect of that parasite on your physical body. And unfortunately, before you realize it, usually the damage is severe and at times irreversible. But I believe the same thing can happen in our lives spiritually. That there are spiritual parasites that, given enough time, will eat away and will grow and will multiply, and they will cause damage within our lives that we never, ever saw coming. And so when we look at things that we would consider to be a spiritual parasite, if you will, there's a number of things that we could talk about this morning. There's a number of things that we could look at and say, that's a spiritual parasite. That's a spiritual parasite. That is something that, given enough time, will destroy my life, destroy me spiritually. But I want to kind of hone in over the next 2 weeks, over today and next week. I kind of want to address just one of those things. One of those spiritual parasites, if we're going to use that term, that I believe can cause severe damage in the life of a follower of Jesus. And before I get to that, I want to first back up a little bit and kind of look at what, we talk about what it means to be a believer, what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And we would probably, if we were to make a list of characteristics of what a Jesus follower looks like, I'm sure that all of you this morning could think of a number of things that we could write down that we would say, yes, this is indicative of a follower of Jesus. This is a characteristic that a Christian, if we understand the Bible, this is what a Christian should do or what a Christian should have in their life. And I believe that one of those key characteristics that's synonymous with being a believer and being a Christian is that we are people of faith. We're people of faith. And I say that, and some may be kind of wondering why I would bring up such a no-brainer concept. Well, of course, we're people of faith. I mean, every religion out there has some sort of faith component to it. You know, what makes that us any different? But I really believe that at the core, at the heart of who we are as Christians, that a trait that is synonymous with who we are, it's at the very core, the foundation of who we are, is this fact that we are people who have faith. We are people of faith. Not just faith in faith or faith in some being, cosmic being that may have had a part in the creation of the world, but very specifically our understanding of salvation hinges on this idea of faith. Faith in the Son of God. Faith in Jesus. Ephesians 2:8, the New Living Translation says this: God saved you by His grace when you believed. And you can't take credit for this. It is a gift of God. God saved you by His grace when what? When you believed. The NIV says in Ephesians 2:8, for it is by grace you have been saved through what? Through faith. Through faith. And this not from yourselves. It is the gift of God. The very foundation of our salvation is the work that Jesus did on the cross. And our response to that work by the faith that we put in it. Right? It doesn't say that we're saved by grace by our actions. Right? We're not saved by grace by our following something. It says that we are saved by grace through our faith, through our belief in this event that took place, in this person that we say exists. And that's the Son of God, Jesus Christ. We are people of faith. You cannot be a Christian and separate faith from the equation. You cannot experience salvation and separate faith from the equation. It's synonymous with who we are as people. I love the 11th chapter of Hebrews. Many would refer to this chapter as the faith chapter, if you will. But the 11th chapter of Hebrews, it's a little bit too long to read the entire chapter in a sermon. It contains 40 verses. And so I'm not going to obviously read the entire chapter for you this morning, but I do kind of want to look at what it has to say in certain places. Because this chapter really is a really good synopsis, if you will, of a number of different people that we've read about through the Old Testament and their response to God based on their faith, which is why we often refer to this as the faith chapter. Right? It's a synopsis of all of these different events that took place that you and I have read throughout the Old Testament. These different heroes, if you will, of the faith that we often will refer to them as. But it goes through this chapter and it breaks down all of these different people's responses to God. And what it's highlighting for us is their faith response. Okay? So let's just look at a little bit of what it says here. In Hebrews 11, just the first 3 verses says this: faith shows the reality of what we hope for it is the evidence of things we cannot see. Through their faith, the people in days of old earned a good reputation. By faith, we understand that the entire universe was formed at God's command, that what we see did not come from, what we now see did not come from anything that can be seen. That gets me tongue-tied every time I read that verse. I'll read verse 3 again. By faith, we understand that the entire universe was formed at God's command, that what we now see did not come from anything that can be seen. And so this is kind of like the beginning of this chapter. Kind of the writer of Hebrews is kind of laying the foundation for what he's going to talk about next as he begins to highlight these different people's response to faith. And so we see what he says faith is, that faith is this hope in something that we can't see, that there's something beyond ourselves, right? That we have faith in something that we hope for, but yet we don't actually see it with our physical senses. And then it goes on through the rest of the chapter to kind of highlight people like Abel and Enoch. It talks about Noah and Abraham and his wife Sarah. It goes on to talk about Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses. And each of these people, it mentions this kind of a clip or a highlight, if you will, from their stories in the Old Testament of what they did and how it was their response to God's call of their life, and it was a response of faith. Right? And so then it says in Hebrews 11, 32 through 35, after we see that all these different heroes of the faith and what they've done, this highlights of all these things, he goes on to say this: how much more do I need to say? It would take too long to recount the stories of the faith of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and all the prophets. By faith, these people overthrew kingdoms, ruled with justice, and received what God had promised them. They shut the mouths of lions, quenched the flames of fire, and escaped death by the edge of the sword. Their weakness was turned to strength. They became strong in battle and put whole armies to flight. Women received their loved ones back again from death. And so the writer of Hebrews highlights these heroes of the faith and then goes on to say, the list could go on and on and on. I could continue to tell you of the faith of all of these other people. All of these other heroes in the Bible that we read about in the Old Testament. But there's not enough space and time to go into all of the details of all of these people who their faith did something. That God moved in a way in their lives in response to the faith that they had in Him. And he concludes the chapter in Hebrews 11 with 39 through 40. He says this: all these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us. And so we see this conclusion that though these men and women mentioned here were heroes of the faith, that they had a good reputation because of their faith, they still did not yet receive all that God had planned. That you and I are recipients of something that their lives foreshadowed, and that was the salvation of our souls through Jesus Christ. Tying the faith of those people to our own. And so when I say that I believe that one of the characteristics of a follower of Jesus that must be synonymous with everything that we do, everything that we say, everything that we think, it has got to be that we're people of faith. And I don't say that as like a no-brainer, no-duh type of statement. I mean that as a very profound statement. That faith is important, that faith matters, that our salvation hinges upon our faith in what Christ did. And God's blessing in our lives also hinges on our faith in what He has promised. Our faith in what He has said He will do in our lives. We're either going to believe Him in faith or we're going to doubt Him. There's no middle ground here. We are people of faith. And so anyone who questions the value of faith, in my opinion, has not read the Bible. You cannot question the value of faith and yet read what I read in the Scriptures. Faith is pivotal in our salvation, and it is pivotal in us experiencing God's blessing in our lives. But like the parasites that can often go unnoticed until significant damage is done to our bodies, there is a parasite that also, spiritually speaking, goes unnoticed. Mainly because it goes unnoticed. Or mainly because its effects are not as noticeable. Maybe it's because it starts out small. It starts out in small ways. It shows up in little ways in our lives. But given enough time and given enough ignorance to it, ignoring that it's there, it begins to feed and it begins to grow and it begins to multiply until serious damage occurs. But this parasite isn't feeding on our physical bodies. This parasite is feeding on our faith. And it has a name, and it's called doubt. Doubt. Simple word. We use it all the time. But this small little word, if we allow it into our lives and we let it go undealt with, can cause serious damage to who we are spiritually. Because if who we are in Christ hinges on our faith in Christ, then anything that is designed to attack that faith is dangerous. And there is probably nothing more dangerous to our faith than doubt. Nothing more dangerous to our faith than doubt. It is more dangerous than it looks. You know, there's some animals that when you look at them, you don't have to question whether or not they're dangerous, right? You don't have to. I don't know anybody that wants to, unless you're crazy, wants to cuddle up with a wolverine, right? Or wants to cuddle up with a lion. Again, unless there's something not right up here. I don't know anyone that thinks it's a good idea to give belly rubs to a great white shark. Because we know when we look at those animals, they're dangerous. They have sharp teeth, right? They eat meat. They're aggressive. They're at the top of the food chain in their world. And we don't have to question. We don't have to say, I don't know if that's a safe animal to play around with. We know that it's not. Because it's visible. It's clear. We don't have to question it. But then there's other animals that we're not so sure about because they look cuter. And they look nicer. And they look smaller. And they look gentler and more meek. And so when you look at them, we say things like, oh, look how adorable, or look how cute, or look how pretty that animal is. Look at how docile that animal is. And so we don't always see the danger that might be lurking within that cute little unnoticeable package, right? And this is the case with one animal known as the yellow dart frog. The yellow dart frog is this little tiny frog about this big with this bright yellow skin. And it looks really neat. And it doesn't look like a fat, bumpy toad. I mean, they're slender. They got smooth, shiny skin, right? It's a neat looking animal. But you know, to look at that and think, oh, look how neat. Look how colorful. Look how harmless that little frog is would be a mistake. Because the yellow dart frog's skin secretes enough venom, enough toxin, I should say, not venom, but a toxin secretes out of their skin so powerful that one little yellow dart frog can kill 10 men just by touching it. But from the outside, it looks harmless. It looks as though it can't really hurt you. And that's sort of how doubt is. You know, we can think as Christians of a number of things that we would say these are dangerous things. These are dangerous behaviors. These are dangerous situations. We need to stay away from them, right? No one's going to argue that. There are certain sins that we can think of that we would say that is a very dangerous thing to get involved in. No one's going to question that. But when we think of that list of like these really dangerous habits or dangerous sins or dangerous relationships to be in, right? We don't often give doubt the same weight, do we? Because it's just doubt, you know? Well, it's not like some of these other things. And I believe that would be a mistake. Because it may seem harmless compared to those other big things that we might be struggling with. But the reason I believe that the parasite of doubt is so dangerous is because it attacks the very core, the very heart of who we are as followers of Jesus. It attacks our faith. Doubt is the enemy of faith. It's not simply an annoyance. It's not just a disturbance. It's not a bad habit. It's not a character flaw. Doubt is the enemy, the mortal enemy of faith. Because faith is to believe in what we cannot see or fully understand. Okay? It doesn't take faith to believe in something that you can see, touch, and interact with. When we know how it works, it doesn't take faith to believe that. It doesn't take faith because we know, we can see it, we can interact with it, we can understand it. Right? Faith is to put our hope into something that we can't see, that we can't fully understand. Doubt is to reject or to deny anything that requires faith to believe in it. It's to deny or reject anything that requires faith to believe in it. That is what doubt is. Now, whether we're talking about doubt in something minor, like doubt in whether or not the weather projection is going to be correct, or whether we're talking about doubt in the big things, like doubt that God really is going to hear my prayer, or doubt that God is really going to come through and provide what I need, or doubt that God is really going to intercede or reconcile a relationship, or doubt that Jesus even is who he claimed to be. Doubt is the enemy of faith because it causes us to deny or reject that which requires faith to believe in it. And that is why it is so dangerous. Hebrews 11:6 says this, "And it is impossible to please God without faith. Anyone who wants to come to him must believe that God exists and that he rewards those who sincerely seek him." It is impossible to please God without faith. And it is impossible, my friends, to have faith when we are overwhelmed with doubt. We may be able to say the right words. We may be able to pray the right prayers. But in our heart and in our mind, if we are overwhelmed with doubt, if we are burdened with doubt, what we say means nothing because in our hearts we just simply don't believe. Because that is what doubt does. It robs us of our capacity to believe God. It robs us of our capacity to have faith in his promises. And it is a dangerous parasite that you and I have to do everything we can to get rid of in our lives. A lot of you know of the rebellion of the Israelites after Moses led them out of Egypt. I would imagine everyone in this room has heard that multiple times. Moses leads the Israelite people out of Egypt in the great Exodus. Prior to that happening, God performs a number of miraculous feats to include all of these plagues. And not only does he perform all of these plagues, but if you read in Exodus, you'll see that for most of those plagues, the Israelite people were exempt from them, that God had prevented them from experiencing, not all of those plagues, but most of them, God had prevented them from experiencing them. And then finally, after they're allowed to leave Egypt, God begins to do these profound miraculous things like splitting a sea for them to walk through, by guiding them with a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. I mean, that's not something you see every day, right? And so they've seen God do these things, and Moses is leading them out of Egypt, and he's doing that because God had made a promise to Abraham that one day his descendants would inhabit a land that he was a foreigner in, the land of Canaan. That they would inhabit that land. It was a promise given to Abraham. And God was about to make good on that promise by leading the Israelite people, the descendants of Abraham, into that land that God had promised to give them. And so they're coming up to this place that's going to be their promised land, as we've often referred to it. The land flowing with milk and honey. The promised land. Moses is leading the people so that they can take this land. Now remember, this land is occupied by foreign nations, by pagan nations. It's not empty land. They're going to have to go in. They're going to have to take it. All right? By force. God had allowed the Israelites to be slaves in Egypt for 400 years or so. Because he was waiting for the iniquity, the Bible tells us, of those other nations to become so severe that they were worthy of judgment. And so they're getting ready to go into this land, and they're about halfway to the promised land, which, a journey that takes less than a month to get from Egypt to the land that they were going to possess. It was less than a month's journey by foot. Right? Some scholars say as short as 11 days. And so they get about halfway, and Moses sends some spies ahead of them to go. And you've heard the story. He sends these spies into the land to kind of scout the land out so they can come back and report to the people. And these spies come back and they return, and rather than giving a proclamation of good news by saying the land is ripe and ready for us to take it, they come back in fear and distrust. Rather than trusting God, they begin to kind of freak out a little bit about what they had seen, about these giant people that they had seen, and about their military might, and about the forces in which they possess. With the exception of two of those spies, Joshua and Caleb. But all the others doubted God in that moment. There's no way we can take this land. And not only do they doubt, but they begin to spread that doubt to the people. In fact, it tells us in Numbers 14, 1 through 4. It says, then the whole community began weeping aloud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus of protest against Moses and Aaron. If only we had died in Egypt, or even here in the wilderness, they complained. Why is the Lord taking us to this country only to have us die in battle? Our wives and our little ones will be carried off as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to return to Egypt? Then they plotted against themselves. Let's choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. How quickly they had forgotten what they had been rescued from. They had spent generations as slaves. They had seen God do miraculous things. And now all of a sudden, because of what they saw in front of them, they doubted God's ability to follow through with his promises. Doubt had completely taken over the camp. The people had doubted God, and they now were doubting Moses, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. They aren't believing for a minute that God is going to give them victory because all they can see are the giants in front of them. All they can see are their circumstances. Look what happens next in Numbers 14, 5 through 10. Then Moses and Aaron fell face down on the ground before the whole community of Israel. Two of the men who had explored the land, Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, tore their clothing. They said to all the people of Israel, the land we traveled through and explored is wonderful land. And if the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us safely into the land and give it to us. It is rich land flowing with milk and honey. Do not rebel against the Lord and don't be afraid of the people of the land. They are only helpless prey to us. They have no protection, but the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. Verse 10 says, but the whole community began to talk about stoning Joshua and Caleb. Then the glorious presence of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites at the tabernacle. Finally, God had had enough. He had displayed his might and his power over and over again to them. He had showed that he was more than capable of fulfilling his promises. And yet the people rebelled in doubt. So much so that they were willing to go back into slavery and to stone those who said otherwise. And God had had enough. He was fed up. And he shows up. And he says this in verse 11. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will these people treat me with contempt? Will they never believe me, even after all the miraculous signs I have done among them? A very good question. A question that I believe God still continues to ask today. They were making a judgment about the outcome based on the present. The people of Israel were making a judgment on the outcome of this battle based on what they could see in the present, not based on what they had already seen God do time and time again. At this point, God basically says that he's going to destroy them. He's going to wipe them out and start over with Moses. And Moses pleads with him not to do that. For the sake of his own name, not to do that. And God, the Bible says that God relented. And rather than destroying them, he says, that's fine. But they will never inherit this land. Not those who are alive anyway. That for 40 years they were going to wander in the wilderness until every male over the age of 20 was dead. With the exception of Joshua and Caleb. And that they would have to die before the people would be allowed to go into the promised land. And so they wander for 40 years. A journey that should have taken around 11 to 20 days turned into a journey that would take generations, would take decades, would take 40 years. Something that God wanted to do now would be delayed. You see, I don't believe that today we are all that different. I don't. I believe that God has a plan for each and every single person in this room. To every person who will hear this message, God has a plan for. He has a desire to do things in our lives that only he is able to do. And in fact, you can probably think back to times in your life where God had moved and done things in your life that were preparing you for the plan that he had for you. Maybe at the time you didn't notice it. At the time you didn't understand it. But I'm sure that every person in this room can think back on times in their lives where God moved in a way that only he could move. That he did something that only he could do. That we could not fabricate it. We could not duplicate it. That only he could do it. And he did those things to prepare us for the plan that he had for us. And like the miracles and signs that God gave to the Israelites in Egypt, I'm sure that we can point to times in our lives where God did the miraculous even. Where he did the powerful thing that he can do. But like the Israelites, we forget. How quickly we forget. And what we do is we see this thing in front of us. We see the giants in front of our lives that we look at and we say, there's no way I can overcome that thing. There's no way I can get through this thing that I'm going through right now. Because we're making a judgment on the outcome based on our present. And we're forgetting what God has already done in our lives. It is easy to doubt when we forget what God has already done. But the reason why God has given us a testimony, the reason why we are told to share what God has done in our lives is because our testimony is what bolsters the faith of people who are going through difficult times. Because it tells them that if God can do it in your life and in my life, he can do it in their life as well. We need to be reminded of what God has done in our lives so that when we face those difficult things, those giants in front of us, we don't doubt him. We can trust him because we know he's already proven himself to be faithful. We are just like them so many times. It's easy to doubt when we forget what's already been done. Perhaps this morning you can think of a time in your life. Maybe you're going through a time in your life right now where you are in the wandering stage. That God had given you a vision, a dream, a plan, a calling, and for whatever reason you chose to doubt it. And so rather than seeing God's plan fulfilled in your life, you've been wandering. You're in the middle of those 40 years. Or maybe you've experienced that. Maybe you've experienced what it's like to doubt God's plan and to have to wander for a while. It's not a fun place to be. It's not a comfortable place to be. Perhaps what God wanted to do in your lifetime years ago hasn't happened yet. Perhaps what God wanted to do years ago hasn't happened yet. Because you're wandering. Because you doubted. Israel tried to do it on their own. God told them what their punishment would be, what the result of their doubt would be, and they would have to wander. And what did they do? They said, no, never mind. We changed our mind, God. We'll go. We'll go. We'll do it. They doubted God, and God had said enough is enough. And now all of a sudden, they were uncomfortable. They didn't like what they had to do. Okay, God, never mind. We'll go. We'll do what you asked of us. Only this time, they tried to do it without God's blessing and in their own strength. And Numbers 14:41 through 44 says this. But Moses said, why are you now disobeying the Lord's orders to return to the wilderness? Because remember, God had said, you will go back into the wilderness and you will stay there. And they're saying, no, we're going to go. And Moses says, why are you disobeying him? He says, it won't work. Verse 42, do not go up into the land now. You will only be crushed by your enemies because the Lord is not with you. When you face the Amalekites and the Canaanites in battle, you will be slaughtered. The Lord will abandon you because you have abandoned the Lord. But the people defiantly pushed ahead toward the hill country, even though neither Moses nor the ark of the Lord's covenant left the camp. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in those hills came down, attacked them, and chased them back as far as Hormah. God had promised to do something. They doubted it. They didn't like the consequences of their doubt, so they thought that in their own strength and in their own might, they would try to do what only God was able to do. And they paid severely for it. Because God was no longer with them. And they were slaughtered. They were slaughtered. We are not people who walk by sight or by our own strength, by our own wisdom, by our own cunning and ingenuity. We're not people who walk by our own talents and our own giftedness. The Bible says that we are people who are to walk by faith. To walk any other way will only end in wandering defeat. To walk in any other way, my friends, will only end in our wandering in the wilderness. And when we try to do it in our own strength and in our own might, we will only end in defeat. And this is why I say doubt is so dangerous. It is so dangerous because it attacks the very core of who we are as followers of Jesus and our faith. And if doubt can cause us to no longer believe God to do the things that he says he will do, to provide the things he says he will provide, what's going to happen? here's what's going to happen. If we no longer believe God's word, when he says, do not worry about what you will eat or drink, I will provide those things for you, then what happens when we're going through a difficult financial time, rather than trusting God and waiting on his provision, we're going to make decisions to try to circumvent our suffering that maybe are not the right decisions because we don't really believe that God is going to provide. And so we will make decisions and have priorities and do things that are not going to honor him to try to relieve ourselves of the suffering. That is what doubt will do. It will cause us to do things to circumvent God and his plan in our lives, and it will only end in our defeat. We cannot allow the parasite of doubt to get its teeth into our spirit and into our lives, because it will go unnoticed for a while. And the thing about doubt, it's a silent parasite that the only person who really knows that you have it is you. Other people aren't going to know because they're going to see your hands raised. They're going to hear you praising God and lifting up your prayers, talking all the right talks, saying all the right things. Only you will know that in your heart of hearts there is doubt that has crept in and has infected and taken hold. We cannot allow that to happen, because though it may go unnoticed, it will eventually, it can kill. It can kill. And so I close in encouraging everyone here this morning to examine their heart, to examine whether or not they have allowed the parasite of doubt into their lives. We're going to continue this conversation next week. I'm going to talk more about this concept of doubt. Only next week, what I hope to do is to kind of show where where doubt often comes from. Some of the traps that are set for us, that the enemy sets for us, so that we can allow doubt into our lives, and what you and I can do to overcome it. How you and I can defeat the power that doubt will want to control in our lives. Amen.